Welcome to the Biz Owner 360 podcast, where we explore a variety of topics to help you grow your bootstrapped business. I'm your host, Brett Trainer. Each week, I have a conversation with leading experts in the areas of growth, execution, leadership, wellness, productivity, and other areas. This is not the typical podcast. We have conversations that dig deep into each of the topics that we cover. The goal is to provide cutting edge but proven tactics and strategies to grow your business. The Biz Owner 360 podcast is now recognized as a top 5% international podcast and growing. My guest today is Paul Shirley. Paul is the author of a great new book called The Process is the Product. Paul is a former professional basketball player and author whose theories about habits, rituals, and routines underpin the process. Paul is the author of several other books and the host of the Process podcast. Entrepreneurs and business owners are constantly in scramble mode. Today, Paul and I discuss how to add some process to the chaos and get more done in less time. This productivity focus has been a game changer for me, and I think it can really help you as well. Now, on to the interview. Hey, good morning, Paul. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to talk to a fellow Iowa Stater.
Exactly. So this is kind of an interesting. After I read your book and then started binging on your content, I almost forgot that that's where I first knew you was from the Iowa State days, and probably the other part that I forgot after I read your book was the Phoenix Suns blog, which is absolutely fantastic. Back in the day, I forgot that was you. I forget 2 and 2. It's been a few years since you wrote that, but yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it feels like I've led or have already experienced several lives, which I think is the right way to live a life, right? I do feel like when I am on my deathbed, I will take some satisfaction in the sense that I packed a lot in.
Oh, there's no doubt. And you're only, 40?
44.
44.
Yep.
All right. I'm heading towards the double nickels this year, so.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's, I mean, I think like this isn't the subject of your podcast, but aging is more and more interesting to me because it's only been 100 years that we've all planned to live as long as we will. And so we're all having to deal with that. Like, we're not going to retire at 65. Hopefully we're still pretty sentient until we're in our 80s. And we're not really equipped for that because culturally that hasn't been the case for most of our human existence. So I think it's interesting thinking about aging and how it has changed.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And, longevity has become another topic of mine that I'm binging on, podcasts and research and just kind of the technology around it and the belief system around it. And right, if we can hang on, the medicine, and again, way off topic already, but aging is a disease, right? I think people treat it as it's what happens. And I think we're finding that it's not just what happens. It's how you treat your body and some of the things you can do mentally and physically to, continue to grow and learn. So yeah, I'm with you. I have no plans on retiring. I just want to make sure I'm in a place where I'm doing what I want to do when I want to do it versus the retiring from the job. So, all right. So back to the topic at hand, even though we cover everything in this podcast anyway, so we're fine, but congrats on the new book. It was a journey for you to get to this one. And that's really why I wanted to have you on the show. It's about I should have it here. Show everybody. It's the process is the product. And like I said, I told you offline, I've been fascinated and all in on process, right? And how do I improve my performance? And I had an author on, and well over a year ago, Steve Glavesky, that was talking about time rich and how that's what we should be trading money for time, et cetera, et cetera. But he outlined the concept of flow. And that was kind of the first time I heard it. And I get it, right? You as the former athlete, you get on the basketball court, you experience as a writer. And I think we all have those moments, but it's really hard to get into. And really make a long intro longer. It's, where your book really helped to see was that there's actually a process you can follow to, be the most productive self that you are. So thank you for writing the book. And I'd love to kind of get in. Why did you write it? And I'd love to get into some things that the audience can take away from it.
Well, first, thanks. And thanks for noticing the part about flow. I think that is one thing that's maybe entering the zeitgeist more and more all the time, but it is a little conceptual for people. So it makes me happy when people understand that that's what we're really aiming for here. Is that's why the book's called what it's called, right? The process is the product. So taking what you thought, we all think in terms of, well, I got to finish this thing, whatever this thing is, whether that's starting a business, finishing a book, a basketball career, whatever it might be, that then I will be happy, right? When I get to the end, I will be happy. And what we learn over and over, and what everybody knows by now, is that that's not true. What is true is that there is a way to fall in love with the process. Now, like you said, people say that a lot, but how do you actually do it? And so my hope is that by going through some of the things that I've experienced, the ways that I've failed, the ways that I've picked myself back up, I can illuminate that in a way that is the two of us, me and the reader, kind of looking at my experience and letting them learn through that, as opposed to trying to tell them, here's exactly what you need to do. As you mentioned, there are ways to find a state of flow, but they are uniquely personal, right? Somebody, like, I don't have any kids, so I can get up and run my morning kind of however I want. Somebody else may have a bunch of kids running around, so that's not necessarily realistic. So they may have to wait till later in the day to set up a time when they might reach a flow state. It's also personal in the sense that each of us is more familiar with different kinds of flow states or different contexts for flow. So, for me, basketball was what helped me understand that. But it was also growing up playing baseball. It was also doing woodworking projects with my dad. It was sometimes even, taking care of the animals. But then as we grow up, we realize, like, oh, you can find a flow state in a great conversation.
Yes.
You can find a flow state while cooking. And so helping people see that they may already know this, they might already be experiencing it. Now, how can we translate that to other aspects of your life? So if you're already hitting a flow state when you're cooking with your wife, let's say, then thinking about, like, well, what's the routine you go through? What are the cues that allow you to get there? Oh, we put on music, we pour a glass of wine, and now suddenly we're just in it. We're cooking, we're talking, all of those things. All right, well, you want to be in a flow state when it comes to working on a pitch deck, let's say. You've got a big presentation coming up, and it's a month away, and you need to do 20 minutes a day to get there. Well, how can you cue yourself into that in a work environment? Maybe that's coffee, maybe it's music again, maybe it's turning off your phone, maybe it's doing 5 push-ups, whatever it is, but like building a way in, a ramp in. Habits, people talk about that being the cue, and then the behavior is, of course, what you're actually doing or accomplishing, and then figuring out also what's the reward. So right. Cooking with one's wife, the reward may already be pretty implicit. Like, we have connection, we have a bond through that. When we're starting new processes, sometimes we have to overload on a new kind of reward. Like, we have to be really militant about, when I'm done, I give myself this reward of a piece of chocolate or a glass of scotch or whatever the thing is, in order to, like, really solidify that habit or that process.
Yeah, and you've outlined a couple of stories and examples of was it the Eagles? Was it not Glenn Fry? It was he had the tea, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was the process, and it was interesting. As I kind of outlined from that book last year, carved out 3 hours in the morning just to the routine, say, hey, this is blocked off, this is scheduled, this is when I'm going to do the productive work or the flow work. Mm-hmm. But what you kind of outlined, which opened my eyes, is you got to have a stop time, right? Because that's where you can run into danger being a strong word, right? But if I'm in a roll, I'm going to keep going, probably nothing wrong with that. But then, as you outlined in the book, then your brain goes, whoa, man, that's not what I signed up for. And it kind of throws you out of that. So, was it just trial and error as you went through the process? Because within the book, there was you had your 10 personal steps that you went through, and then you outlined 6 that people should follow. And I actually found both of them really interesting, because there was some nuggets in there that, I always thought, hey, you get into the flow state, and when it ends, it ends. But obviously that hasn't worked as well, right? So,
well, I think it goes back to one thing for me that has made sense, is comparing it to meditation. So meditation teachers will talk often about how when the bell sounds to mark the end of meditation, you have to come back, because yes, we want you in that meditative state, but now we have to be realistic that now it's time to go back to life. And it's a similar concept of knowing that because there is an end, you're more likely to push yourself into that flow state. And similar to meditation, you don't do meditation for the 5 minutes or the 10 minutes or the 15 minutes. You're hoping to apply that to the rest of your life, right? And so in this same way, we think of like creating a practice of hitting these flow states. When we, an easy example is my past and most people are familiar with some level of how sports work, right? So practice doesn't go forever. There is an end point, because we know like our bodies can only go for so long. We may have the gym rented only for so long. And so we don't think I'm going to, practice basketball for 10 hours one day and then 0 hours for 6 days in a row. That would be insane. What we do is instead we have basketball practice that lasts 2 hours or an hour and a half or 2.5 hours or whatever it is. And in that period of 2.5 hours, you're not going to be in the flow state the whole time. There's going to be drink breaks and times when you lose concentration and all of that. But that's our window that we work with. And what is true about basically every person who is successful, who's creative, all of these things, is they have figured out how to build these systems into their lives. I didn't understand that when I first started writing. When I was writing for myself, for ESPN, even working on my first book, even working on a second failed book, I thought you wrote when you felt like it, and you, like you said, you stayed with it for as long as you could, but that didn't work very well. And I had this realization when I was 33, 34, that I didn't know what I was doing when it came to writing. Fortunately, I had this background in sports, and that allowed me to see like, oh wait, I do know the answer. I've already done it. I just need to apply it to it in a different context.
Yeah.
And so that's what led me to this understanding or this transfer from sports to then the creative pursuits. And then I started to see like, oh man, this is really everything. I mean, you could make the case that even in your relationships, you have to kind of go through a process of the way you talk to people, right? So like I've noticed, I often, especially when counseling people on their systems, their habits, I may already know the answer for them. Like I can see where they need to get to, but they might not be ready to hear that. So I've had to train myself to not just jump in and be like, here's your answer.
Yeah.
And so I've had to come up with a little mantra, which is, I have an idea. Would you like to hear it? Right? So as simple as that, even that is process based, because I recognize like, oh, this wasn't effective in my personal relationships to just jump in and tell this person what I think. So I've had to come up with this thing. Now, over time, it may not be as overt as me going through that exact terminology as I get better at like kind of instituting that mentality. But at the beginning, it's required almost that you have something that's really rigid like that.
Yeah, and I'm curious too, going back to that process, because you said with the practice times it was scheduled in the book, you talk about the two coaches. One had, hey, here's what our schedule looks like. Every Sunday you get that off, and so your brain can think. You think that's an individual preference, or do you think some people are better not knowing when the day off is and they keep working? Curious, I've got a thought, but I'd love to hear yours.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can keep people kind of off balance in an effective way by not telling them all of the information. And I think that can work in the short term, but I don't think that's the way to breed a lifelong habit or process, right? I think if you're in the military, they may not care about your like lifelong plan. They're like, we got to fight this war, so we're going to kind of keep you on your toes, and things may be unsettling from time to time. There's some regularity, but there's some unpredictability. I think when it comes to setting these things up for ourselves, so your audience is largely entrepreneurs, and one thing that's true about entrepreneurship is there are so many variables and there's so much chaos that I think you actually have to side on the idea of being even more rigid to offset the level of chaos. So if your life is pretty static, you may actually need like a little more variability just to keep yourself interested. But if your life is like full chaos, then you actually have to be more rigid with your system.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue or transition, right? Because entrepreneurs, right, most of them aren't working 16 hours a day just to get stuff done. And when I started thinking about the process, right, even though in the book it is really kind of focused on writing or creatives, but I think it applies to anything, and kind of curious to get your perspective. So if one of the things I'm doing is writing a book, I'm finally getting back into doing that. So I've carved out time. I've got to write some blog posts for the business, and then I've got to do some others. So if there is three things, like my sole outcome is not to finish the book, right? But I've got to balance these things. Is it the same? You think it's the same process, right? There's, hey, 3 or 4 things that I need to do. Here's what my routine is for this hour. I'm going to do this, and then schedule 4 hours, right? And then the other 6, because the other 2-part question, I promise I'll let you get back to it, is, right, we've learned, and I've experienced in the corporate world in the past, like you're only really productive for a couple hours a day max. And corporate is just because there's meetings and you're just never time. But even in the truly deep flow state, I've heard anywhere between 2 and 4 hours is max where you can give some of your best work. So that being said, how would you as an entrepreneur, which I know you're going through this process now, think about that with the tasks that you have? Is it simply creating a process and a system for each of that, or how would you approach it?
Yeah, it's a good question because people do want that prescription. I think all I can lean on is what I do, right? So I would err again on the side of giving oneself radically less time to accomplish things. The less time you give yourself, better chance you have of reaching a flow state. Because there's different research on this. Some people say that the maximum amount of time on average for people to be in a flow state is 50 minutes, but I think that's hard for most people. I would say there's other information that says like our brains are going to start to wander every 17 minutes. So I actually try to, right now, I'm in a very harried state because we have a workspace here in Denver that I'm in for the process, right? A co-working space for it is freelancers, creatives, it's people who are on their own, some entrepreneurs, those types of people. Then we have an online version. We also do some business to business stuff, helping companies build better processes. So it's hectic. And right now I'm only able to carve out 30 minutes a day for writing. That's down from, it used to be 45 or 50 minutes, but that's okay. In fact, sometimes I find that I can get as much done in 30 minutes as in 45. And then usually I have in my schedule blocked out, like there's probably 2 more deep, like I will show you in my little planner, right? So I have kind of my days separated into like, here's the day as far as like what I've got. I'm doing this podcast with you. Later, I'm running a session here. Within that though, I allow myself like deep tasks and shallow tasks. So shallow tasks might be just like email Brett to check in about when our podcast is, that's not going to take, I don't have to get into a flow state to do that.
Right.
I might have to briefly concentrate, but it's not like I'm going to go fully deep. But then I might have, like yesterday, I needed to spend 15 minutes on a deep task of setting up tours of our space, right? Like the mechanism for which people would use or by which people would come find us, right? Now, realistically, writing for 30 minutes is a load on the brain. And then 15 minutes of like really thinking about like, how is this going to work when we get people in here for tours? That's another little load on the brain. And then I probably only have 1, maybe 2 more of those 15 to 20 minute stints of like being in a deep state where my phone is off, where I'm like really having to lock in. And then the rest of the day is taken up by, right, I've got calls, I've got meetings, I've got the stuff that comes up during the day. So for me, it's so much about like front loading those things that I know are going to require deep work so that I can have those done and feel like no matter what happens with the rest of my day, when it blows up, I'll be okay. But I think that, and this is where I go back to, you've read my little story about how when I was a kid, the basketball players would come into the basketball camps and say, well, what you got to do is you got to work hard. I shoot 1,000 shots a day. And so then I, of course, being the like little whippersnapper from a small town that I was like, oh, I better try this. And I realized like, that's impossible. They're lying. And so I think people are lying a lot when they talk about how much they work. They actually say, well, yeah, I worked for 8 hours today, but 6 of it was wasted time. And in fact, because there's so much wasted time, they're actually almost never in a flow state. So they're never doing effective work. So I'm always pushing people. I just finished working with someone individually for 3 months actually. And it was amazing, his misconceptions about like how long he needed to work. We got him down to like, okay, I just want you to concentrate for 20 minutes. And now, okay, maybe 30 minutes. But it's not because we're aiming for 4 hours. It's because we want you to be like a laser. Like you are just locked in. You have this power, this ability that's almost like using the force or something, that you can lock in and focus very quickly and then get out of that state, relax, work on something that's maybe slightly mindless or have a conversation, whatever it might be, and then be able to get back into it really quickly. I've spoken for too long, but I will say one more thing about this. One thing I noticed when we talk about stopping points, and I think this is the value of this idea of building a practice. It used to take me, like when it came to writing, and basketball was probably similar, it would take me 30 minutes, 40 minutes to figure out like where I was, what it was I working on. And the same with, the projects I might be working on. By carving it into these like very short bits and knowing that I only have a certain amount of time, I can get into a flow state in like 20 seconds and I'm there. So what I would say is that intensity is worth so much more than duration. So being able to like get to it really quickly allows you to feel, like I said, like you have this lightsaber where you're super powerful. It should only be used when you need it. And that gives you a sense of just like ability or facility with superpower you're building for yourself.
Yeah, and I think you're so right. If people actually would sit down and realize how much time they're actually really, really, really productively working and moving and pushing the ball forward. I'm still guilty of this with, instead of carving out this small micro next step of the process, it's you get focused on, man, that whole business plan is going to take forever. Not that I'm advocating business plans, but if you could say, I just really need to carve out this piece of it, or what does this offering look like, and spend that 15 minutes. Because I think you're so right on the constraints. If you got 20 minutes to get something done, man, you get it done. If you give me 2 days to do it, guess what? It's going to be that last 20 minutes of the 2 days that it's going to get done. The best of intentions. And I think people's quality of life would improve if they could actually get focused and get more work done in a 2-hour period than they probably do in a 10-hour or 12-hour period, because it's not structured. And I'm just curious, your perspective is, I get a sense not many people actually follow these processes. I'm seeing more of these solopreneurs and lifestyle businesses that they've figured it out. And why can't we, and I think that's what you're working on, how do we take this to the masses, right? And say your quality of life is going to be so much better if you could just learn how to focus, prioritize, and build that little system around it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. I think what we're all fighting with is some of it is the industrial revolution, but also it's the kind of bureaucratic revolution of the 1950s through the 1990s, where there was this attitude that, you would just kind of plug in for your 8 hours and you needed to be kind of on call. And in some cases, that's true, right? Like certain people have jobs where they just need to be present. Somebody's going to be either coming into the business or calling into the business. And I don't know that there's a way around that necessarily. But when it comes to things around self-starting and things that require like long-term, well, basically project-based things. I read a piece recently about how like the economy is changing to a project-based economy versus, I don't know what you would have called it before. In fact, I should remember this because it was in this article. But my life has been all project-based, thankfully. And so that's why I feel uniquely equipped to talk about these things. And sometimes there is a disconnect because I forget. A lot of people have been trained by this kind of, actually, I guess what you would say is their old days were sort of more like, it was what people would call process based, in that it was like, well, here's our company, here's how we do things, and there's just it's an assembly line, more or less. So what we need to do is apply a process based thinking to a project based economy, right, for the individual. Which we're getting in the weeds here as far as terminology a little bit, but it's building systems so that you can accomplish long-term projects, which is, I think, what a lot of people are trying to fight with. But they've been acculturated by this mentality of, 1960s IBM, of just like, you go in, you sit there for 8 hours, you hate your job, you come home, you have some whiskey, and then on the weekends you go on vacation. And that's actually not how most of human history has existed, right? Like if you even look back to what was a caveman after? Well, we got to go hunt this mammoth. That's a project. We got to figure out how to get this mammoth back to the cave. And then once the project's done, you're like, let's relax and eat the mammoth and like, I don't know, smoke some peyote or something. So like a lot of these, like what I would call kind of, I don't know, toxic's the wrong word, but they're not very helpful attitudes are pretty recent. And a lot of people are just so ingrained with that. When talking to my parents, my dad worked for the state of Kansas for 35 years as a research analyst. And it was just, he's there at 7:45. He leaves at 4:45. It does not change. Every day is the same. And so there's no benefit to him to be able to concentrate that he can see.
Right.
And so then, but what we're seeing is that like lots of people are realizing, oh shit, if I can't concentrate, I won't get anything done. I won't move my business forward. I won't move my personal brand forward, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And coming from the corporate world, you can see it. And I think you're right. It's the Industrial Revolution changed everything, because even post caveman, you had like blacksmiths, right? Their people's jobs were kind of their lives, and they worked more when they had to because they had to. But I do think we're moving towards a more project based world. And I think, the analogy I use, I'm seeing more and more like a movie set, right? So the stunt person, the actor, the script writers, everybody comes together for this event, right? They put their best work forward and then they all split up and go do their thing again. And where I think we've seen that with Fiverr and some creatives, I think we're going to see specialists in a ton of different areas that are going to pop up, and being able to apply, what you're talking about. Hey, with the 2 hours of deep work, if I can bring a specialist in that's going to do 2 hours of really good work in this area, I'm going to move my business forward like this, because it's not me procrastinating, not getting it done, not doing it well. I don't have to pay a fortune for it. So I think we're still in the really, really early days of people seeing the power of that. But I think once it gets some momentum and people are tired of going to the office and they realize they have skill sets, that we're going to be able to start to piece these together and push things forward much more efficiently. Then that's why I'm so optimistic for, small business owners and startups, that if they can build the right organization and avoid all those silos, just the inefficiency in those orgs, and when you're living in it, it didn't seem that bad, but looking back at it, right, just people are making that commute for, more than 60 minutes each way every day. And it's just time you're never going to get back. And so, yeah, I think you're out in front of something here that I think as soon as people realize that they can be more productive, they're going to start asking, how do I do this? And I think your book's a great start at that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are headed this way, but there are also a lot of people who are unaware of how difficult it is, because I never want to try to snow people with the idea that these things are easy, right? Like, it's hard to become a self-starter. It's hard to work with self-discipline, those kinds of things. And so for some people, and for the economy as a whole, it has been really good that they were able to just plug in and be told what to do. They may not have enjoyed it, but it was easy.
Right.
And now what we're talking about is like, you're going to enjoy your life more. You're going to have a lot more fulfillment and meaning, but that's going to come through hard work. And that's going to at first seem daunting and unpleasant. And I think that's one thing you're seeing, with the quote great reset and all that, the great resignation, whatever these things are, is that people are also realizing like, whoa, so if I'm just expected to plug in for 8 hours at my computer, that's not very fulfilling. What was fulfilling was I went to an office and there was an ecosystem there. There was a community, and that was what was fun about working. When I'm faced with the fact that I just have to sit here for 8 hours and make myself do it, this sucks. I don't want to do this anymore. We would rather live in a small town and on one income than have to do this. So I think there may be a bit of a bifurcation there where, some people are so put off by self-starting, self-discipline, etc., that they might just say, I don't want to do this at all.
No, I think that's two really good points. One is that, right, there's still no silver bullet, right? You take away and you want to be fulfilled and control your own destiny, but that means you control your own destiny. You're going to have to figure out how to put in the work. And the people that are looking for the shortcuts, there are no shortcuts. So you're right. They would have been better off in an 8 to 9 to 5 environment, get paid, do some good work when asked. But right. So the people that want to take control of lives, I think it's going to create more opportunities. And when you said about the process, one of our, the Iowa State's football coach, Matt Campbell, I love his approach to things. It's process work. And I have one up that I actually post on occasionally, and says, our culture says it's all about me. Our culture says, screw the process. I want instant gratification. Here's a fact. If you fall in love with the process, eventually the process will love you back. And I'm like, exactly. Because what the process, at least for me, what it allows me to do, and I still know I've got further work to do, it gets me to do stuff when I really don't want to do it, right? But the process, I just need to get this done. And I think that can sometimes be the difference between success or failure, or solo or corporate, is doing this stuff when you don't want to do it and you don't feel like doing it. Right.
Yeah. No. So I actually, this is near and dear to my mind, because on the Process podcast that I do with Katie Levisay, who's a neuropsychologist, we were talking about this idea of willpower, and she talks a lot about like the stories you tell yourself about the things you're doing. And I made this analogy between, or this contrast between gulag work and campfire work. So like, if we were in the gulag and I said, you got to go chop that wood, you'd be like, I don't want to chop that wood. But if you went camping and you needed to chop wood for your fire, you'd be like, this is kind of awesome. I did a thing, I made a fire. The same action, it's just different context, right?
Yeah.
So what I talk a lot about with setting up systems is remembering that, yes, if you don't want to do something, it doesn't work very well to just gut your way through it. I mean, there are times where you're like, Jesus, it's the end of the day and I got to get this done. And we have a reservoir of willpower for that that's pretty small, as it turns out. With everything else, it's so much better and so much more effective to figure out like, okay, I don't want to do this. Why don't I want to do it? Okay, we've established that. It seems like it will be boring. Okay, well, how could I make it fulfilling? Could that come from an internal reward of like, I got to write this email? Could I make myself laugh in writing the email? Would it be, is there a way to make it like funny as I do it? Okay, well, maybe that's not the thing. Okay, so could I reward or cue myself to write the email by making myself a really good cup of coffee? And then when I'm done with sending this email, I can listen to my favorite song. Right. So figuring out how to not gut your way through it, but instead create these, I talk a lot about like outsourcing willpower, and that would be an example. So using outside sources in order to push you into a flow state, knowing that once you're in it, most of the time, these things that we dread, once we get into them, we're like, oh, you know what? I feel pretty good about this. I'm doing the thing that I'm good at. It's just that we might be kind of out of gas for the day or whatever the situation is. And that there's no shame in needing those reinforcements. I think that's another part of this, is that we look around and we think like, because of quote, hustle culture and rise and grind culture and all that nonsense, we think like, well, everybody else can just push their way through this. No, they want you to think they can. In reality, we all have these like cues and rewards to get ourselves through things, and that's how things get done.
Yeah. No, and again, I think the sooner we come to terms with that and the more we aggress, you're right, because it's just doing it for the sake of doing it. You're only going to half-ass it. You probably won't give it its best work, but I truly do believe in the process of the approach and the systems. And, one of the other questions I have, I know we're running a little bit out short on your time, so is, can we over systematize it? Or is this really, hey, start with the really important stuff that you really need to, you're deep in your best work, and then you can kind of have less structure around the rest of the day? Because I could see some people going, well, man, I just don't work well with structure. But I think you addressed it a little bit earlier that said, man, if everything's chaos, you need more structure. Right? So how do you find that balance of pure routines? Because there's going to be times when things break down or the schedule falls apart and you can't do it. And I know some people would be freaked out that their schedule is completely disrupted. So how do you balance those two?
I think that is also a thing that can be outsourced. So surrounding yourself with people who will check in with you on how rigid you're being and if that's effective or not effective. So this past weekend, my brother turned 40 and his fiance threw him a party in Kansas City, which is close to where we're from originally. They live in San Francisco now. So it was actually a matter of like flying a bunch of people in. And it was scheduled to sort of start Friday night-ish. But I had to go to Kansas a couple of days early because I was given a talk, University of Kansas, and also was seeing my parents, etc. So originally I had planned to drive back on Monday and to like watch the Kansas City Chiefs play on Sunday with my brother. But on Saturday, I started to get this feeling of like, oh man, I got a long week ahead. I'm not sure I can afford to take that extra day, right? So I had to wrestle with it a little bit of like, am I being too rigid about this? Am I being a workaholic by driving back to Denver a day earlier than I planned? Or is this a good use of my time? And so that was asking my brother, like, hey, so would you be upset if I, left a day earlier than I had planned? And by then he was also exhausted. So he's like, I don't care. We've all had enough. But it was also then sitting with that discomfort myself, right? We have to learn how to be uncomfortable, which, I'm not necessarily a master at it, but I talk about in the book this idea of wallowing with failure, but I think that also applies to just uncomfortable decisions, et cetera. And, I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, but I think this illustrates what we're talking about a little bit, right? Is that, am I letting work dominate my life, or is this a pretty valid reason? And I am so glad that I ended up coming back a day early, because it turned out like we're actually opening this space next week. I had more to do than I even realized. And so I would have been a mess this week if I had not done that. So that's a long way around to, I don't think there's an easy answer, and that's good. If I were trying to give you easy answers, that would be me being a word merchant. But I think like it's that reality of checking in with your partner, your wife, your kids, your family, friends, et cetera, to kind of once in a while get a reality check on like, have I spun myself out here with like too many systems or do I need more? Those things are just really difficult to do, I think, on our own.
Yeah, balance is the key. And the one last thing I want to touch on that you talked about a little bit is people used to have the work ecosystem where they had people and relationships and friendships, which they still do. And I think that's one of the big things I've heard as an argument against not bringing people to the back to the office. I'm like, well, but if people had their choice who they wanted to hang out with and talk about those things, and they had the extra social aspect of it, I think that the space you're creating is a perfect example of that, right? You don't have to be you're forced to work with the people you work with if you work in a big company. Some of them you may like, some of you may not. But the fact is, if you had the ability to be social, right, and get that extra human interaction somewhere else, I think people would be much more willing to give up on the commute and say, hey, I've got a community here. I know it's just a different way of thinking, because that's not the way office people have been, kind of conditioned to do that. Where right now, if you see people in cafes, it is the writers, it's the creative, it's the salespeople that are out on the road. But I think we're going to see more spaces, like what you're creating, for folks to, hey, I do need some human interaction. I need to bounce some ideas off some people, but we're all remote in the workforce. So I'm more of a half full type of guy. So I think where we're heading with the new world order and the digital and remote and everything is super fascinating, and we'll see where it all plays out. But I know there's other folks sitting on the other end going, oh, this is the worst thing ever, right? Change is bad. I liked my routine. So I guess it's how you're looking at the future.
Yeah, I think it is similar to what I was talking about with regard to, if your life is chaos, you'll need more rigidity to deal with that, right? More order to deal with the chaos. And I think that's similar when we talk about, if you're going to work on your own, great, but you're going to need to figure out how to make connections. You're going to have to spend more time making a conscious effort to build connections. There's a book I love by Johann Hari called Lost Connections, which is about how most of depression is actually lack of connection. That people who end up depressed or who end up sometimes even on drugs, oftentimes what they're missing is just human-to-human connection. And the one thing we have to be careful in our pursuit of efficiency is that we might lose that sense of connection. And I think that's what we're seeing. When I look around at the world, a lot of people were initially, COVID time, like, oh, this is amazing. I've been wanting to spend more time with my boyfriend, but then they've kind of their frog has been boiled over time. Right. And you can sense like these people aren't happy, but they're kind of addicted to being depressed in a lot of ways. And so they're afraid to get back to anything like normalcy, not realizing like, yeah, it's going to be a little awkward when you have to get back into social situations, but we need that so desperately. Like it is just baked into us. I've seen that with myself. Like in talking to my therapist back in LA, we identified one of my most important values is personal connection, right? And I don't think I'm alone in that. There's a lot of people who would, if they really got into it, that would be true. And so removing personal connection carves a hole out of your soul. And if you don't figure out a way to fill that, like you'll get sad, right? Loneliness kills more people than like alcoholism or I don't know. There's some stat on that. Like loneliness is really detrimental to our lives. And so I think that's the thing that, similar to what we were talking about before, be careful what you wish for. Yes, you will have control over your own destiny, but it will be lonely. That's one thing that I got a lot in my sports career was people saying like, man, you're so lucky. You get to travel to all these places and play basketball for money. And I was like, well, yeah, I am. I mean, it's better than, as my dad would say, it beats digging ditches, but it is incredibly lonely because I was a mercenary. I was going from team to team without any real sense of, will I be here next year? And that loneliness is hard on people. It was hard on me. It's hard when you are an entrepreneur. It's hard when you're an independent contractor. So to sum up what I'm saying, yes, those things can be a positive change as long as you know what you're signing up for and as long as you're willing to put in the work on the social side in order to cultivate that aspect of your whole being.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And two, I've definitely gotten better at building relationships through video. I mean, some of the folks I talk to all the time, I've never actually met them, but yet I feel like I've known them for 10 years. But there's still something about that human to human, face to face that we need at some point, whether it's not in business, it's personal. And I'm just kind of curious with the space that you're creating. Are you seeing, is that what you're hearing from folks? What's the motivation for people? They just want to get out?
Curious. Yeah, for a lot of people, it is, I got to get out of the house. But For a lot of people, it is the community and the accountability that comes from what I would call positive peer pressure. So our sessions are all really structured. Either they're an hour long or they're 2 hours long. If they're an hour, people write a goal on our big chalkboard. I want to accomplish this in my 45 minutes of actual work time. And then after 45 minutes, I will put on a loud song, get everybody to stop work and come back to the chalkboard. We talk about how it went. And then the longer sessions are similar with a little bit more of an element of community at the end. And what I find is there are some people who are aware that they need these things, but most people, we have to kind of have the medicine go down with the sugar, in that we give people chocolate at the end of each session as a kind of Pavlovian reward.
Yeah.
And so what they find is they're like, oh my God, I didn't realize how much I would like this until I got into it. And so that is a little bit like what I was talking about with regard to kind of the latent depression that you're seeing. It takes changing the behavior, and then you notice like, oh shit, I was not in a great space. And I think when people are on their own all the time, it requires like just doing the thing, and then you see, oh wow, I really like people.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. And you telling that story reminds me of just one last thing. I listened to your solo episode of the podcast where you're talking about the lesson learned, right, as you closed the first shop and moved into the part two and phase two, that you were trying to accommodate all people. And would you see the doers and the don'ters? I'm screwing up what the phrase that you said, but I'm like, God, that's so true. We want to please everybody, and we want everybody to be our target audience. But you found more, I don't know, happiness is the right word, but more satisfaction when you said, hey, these are the folks, these are the tribe that I want. I want these people that are excited, enthusiastic to be about it. And I thought that was just a really insightful. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes as we're questing, right, in our business and our journeys.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think for us, it resonates really quickly with the people who are ready for it, right? So the people who notice, either things are not going great the way I'm doing it, or this is a chance to hook into something I've been thinking about and I would like to do more of. And then the people who are resistant to it, sometimes they come around, but it's, like you're saying, it's. I have a pizza place. We don't have hot dogs here. If you want hot dogs, you're gonna have to go somewhere else. And
Right.
noticing that and being okay with that, like giving up on some short-term gains because the long term is the plan. One of my great bits of sadness is that 2 years ago now, so you mentioned that I ran a business in LA. It was called Writer's Block. It was a co-working space for writers, and that's what kind of gave us this idea that what we were doing made sense for non-writers. So we had, opened a physical space that was our own, which was a big leap. I had taken out a bunch of loans. We fought it for 18 months of it. God, there's something here. We have members, it's going, but it's not quite there. And then I think it was because we committed so fully to our methodology that January, February of 2020, we signed up. It was just uncanny because people finally were starting to get it, to tell their friends. And it was, the momentum was so strong. I was starting to think about, I remember so vividly, I was finally in a place, because I had been losing money for 5 years on this, right? And I was like, oh my God, when we finally get to a point where we're actually breaking even, what if I started to build in a trip to Palm Springs every 2 weeks to get away from this chaos? Because you know how it is when you're running a business, you kind of got to get away once. I was starting to set up new systems and processes that I was really excited about. And then COVID hit, and we went from, revenue of, these numbers are modest, I realize, but the revenue from $22,000 a month to $4,000 a month, just like this, and it was gone. There was just no getting it back. So it was sad, but it also taught me that lesson, like you're talking about, of if people are looking for pizza, or if they're looking for hot dogs at your pizza place, they're never going to find what they're looking for.
Right. And in your lesson on wallowing in the loss and then moving on, right? It's take that lesson and move. So then lastly, just tell me a little bit about how does the virtual co-working space work? Because that's kind of the newer concept too that I'm interested in.
It's been that was a thing that also got silver linings, because back in the Writer's Block days, we needed to move everybody online. We had already started this other company, the process. And so we were like, oh, well, let's try this out. So we started running what we call deep work sessions online. They all happen in a private Discord server. Your listeners may or may not be familiar with Discord. It looks a lot like Slack. And there's an element, again, of one of my staff is there waiting for people to check in. The sessions start on the hour. Everybody sets a goal for what they want to accomplish in that hour, actually in 45 minutes. And then after the 45 minutes is done, we bring them back to the little channel. I actually participated in one before I got on with you. You get back in the channel and now you're discussing like, how did it go? What happened? And one of the things that's cool about it, in the session I was in, there was a person who is in Hungary. There's a person who's in Holland. There's a person who's in California. I was in Denver. There's a person in Texas. So like this kind of international flavor of networking and community gets built along the way.
Yeah, that's super cool. So again, thank you very much for your time. I know we've taken a lot of it today, but I hope people found a lot of value in how they can restructure their days and get more out of these days, and highly encourage people to go check out the book. It's a show me, not tell me type of book, and it's very actionable. So I think you'll see a lot of value. And check out the podcast. You guys have also a lot of really good content. So if folks do want to reach out and learn more, what's the best place for them to find you, Paul?
So yeah, come to createyourprocess.com. There are 3 options on that page. Like, are you interested in us in Denver? Are you interested in the online? Are you interested in this for your business? Any of those ways will get to me very quickly.
Awesome. Well, again, appreciate the time. We'll have to maybe do a follow-up after you get this business rolling even further. If you write another book, we'll bring you back on, because I do think this topic is so important. We can be using our time so much better, and it's not a quick fix, right? We got to embrace it. So I appreciate the insights and the time today.
Thanks, Brett, and go Cyclones.
Yes, go Cyclones.